Welcome to Something to Talk About from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. I'm Reed Price, the director here. Ann Lovejoy is with us today to talk about gardening. We're in the throes of summer, no doubt about it, but it's not too early to start thinking about the fall.
Isn't
Before
that
we get
weird?
to that, before we get to that, I want to thank Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island. They offer assisted and independent living and vibrant memory care, and they sponsor Something to Talk About at the Senior Community Center. They have a lovely campus up on Rolling Bay, and you can visit and have lunch on them and take a tour. 206-594-1010 is the phone number to make arrangements. Ask for Celia or Jamie. You can check out their website at fieldstonecommunities.com. Also, we would like to acknowledge that we are meeting and living and gardening on the ancestral homeland of the Puget Sound Coast Salish, specifically the Suquamish tribe, the people of the clear saltwater, who have been taking care and being good stewards of this land and these waters since time immemorial. We honor them and we are learning from them. And thanks again for joining us. I think it looked like you guys were having a fun time today out doing a little gardening in front of the center.
Yeah, it was a little hot, but we got there a little early and we've been watering and deadheading. Deadheading is a big piece of what happens at this time of year if we want to keep that floral bloom coming. It's not always fun, but I've been fascinated to notice that Anita and other people sit down in chairs when they do that kind of stuff. And I thought this could change my life. It never crossed my mind that I could sit in a chair and deadhead, but guess
If
what?
your
It's
if
perfect.
if if your calendula are high enough, it works perfectly.
Lots of things are high enough. We've been trimming shrubs and um, all kinds of perennials and things. And yeah, I mean, yes, sometimes you still have to get down. Now, the one thing I've learned about getting down is make sure you have a way to get back up. Like one of my good friends who's a very in her 90s always said, I never get down unless I have a 5-gallon bucket next to me because you can always use your 5-gallon bucket for support to get it back up again. And I did that over the years, and she is so right. What a great idea, right?
Probably works in your house as well as your garden.
You can use a chair in your house, kind of get yourself back up. Or use a grandchild. That's the other thing. I say, honey, with your sharp little eyes, could you please find the needle I just dropped? Or whatever, right? Yeah. Anyway, I did want to talk a little about what's blooming because I've had a number of questions about what will take the heat. And the good news is a lot of the flowers that come from South and Central America, for instance, don't mind the heat at all. We've been really amazed at how well the dahlias are doing at the senior center without having been watered at all. Granted, we did have five, and we now have maybe what, three or four. Two or three
Yeah.
look really good, and one looks kind of iffy, and one is just gone. Dahlias traditionally were considered to be not hardy, but they've been bred over the years to be hardier. And so if you leave them in the ground and put mulch over, we put wood chip mulch over them, they usually do come back. And because they come from South and Central America and parts of Mexico, they're used to being hot and dry, and they don't rely on water. They have big storage tubers, and they do really, really well. I mean, they can dry out eventually, but they're not thirsty like a lot of plants that are bred to do well in, say, England, where or Scotland, the climate is tends to be moister, right? So one thing to think about too with dahlias and really any of the summer bloomers is the more you deadhead them, the more they're going to keep producing bloom. And that piece is when you deadhead too, you don't just take the flower off. You follow the stem down to where you can see, like, are there buds following it? Then you'd cut just above that so those buds have a chance to do their thing. But if you have a lot of bare stems sticking up, it really looks kind of pathetic. Um,
It looks like my garden. No,
well, it looks like you're trying to put stakes out for the deer, right? Stick them in the eye.
or
But
or maybe you're working for the Adams family.
right, the garden of the dead. The other, so dahlias are great high summer performers. They do, some of them need some water, especially the ones like field grown dahlias. People have asked me about that. How come they're doing okay in my garden, but in the fields they have to water? Well, think about it. The fields are, there's they're weeded, so it's bare dirt, reflected heat bouncing back up. It's a lot hotter and a lot drier than in our gardens, where hopefully you have mulch and maybe even companion plants around them so that you're helping preserve that little bubble of moisture at the top of the soil that helps the plants. That's the real active zone for a lot of plants. Um, so not having them grown in, that vacuumable, sterilized garden setting, they'll do a lot better. Zinnias are another one that I was amazed when I was visiting Chicago Botanic Garden years ago. They just threw the zinnia seeds around and never watered or did anything to them, and they bloomed all summer. Well, that doesn't happen here because here there's a lot of other things that are interested in growing too. And growing from seed, you have to actually start them in little containers, let them get a good size on them, and then get them back out into the garden, or they may get swamped by nature and her eager helpers. But zinnias are great long-term bloomers. They're also very good cut flowers. Actually, so are dahlias. We had some questions about why cut flowers don't make it, or why uh, some cut flowers in a cutting garden might fail really fast. There's a couple of reasons for that. Before you cut flowers, if you're going to do a wedding or a party or something like that, you want to rely on those plants. Make sure they're well irrigated all up coming up to the, not just the day before, but like up until the event. You want to make sure that the plants are irrigated because they will take up water all through their stems and foliage and those flowers. And instead of being half dried out already, they'll be well moisture packed, and then they'll last a whole lot longer as cut flowers. The other thing is when you cut, if you cut early in the morning or even in the cool of the evening, they're going to do much better than if you cut in the middle of the day when they're at their lowest moisture level. And the thing that works really well is to, like if you're doing again a wedding or event, I had a couple questions about that. I cut them long stems as long as you can, put them in a big bucket of that 5 gallon bucket that you got beside you, put some water in that, put those stems in there. Actually, in a really hot setting, when I was doing some wedding flowers for Discovery Gardens, like it's hot, windy, exposed, I actually filled the bucket all the way and submerged those things for about an hour, and then poured some of the water off so just the stems were getting it, and recut the stems before you use them. So, and you recut them underwater so that they take up water as they're cut, and that seals off the base a little bit. All those things are going to help a huge amount. Also, when you put the flowers into their drink stage, like overnight, make sure they're like in a garage, a cool space in the shade on the north side of the house, somewhere that they're not trying to photosynthesize, and they don't even know they've been chopped off sometimes if the stem is long enough. They're still trying to function. So put them where they're not going to try to be um, growing, continuing, but they can sort of have a chill out session. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, it makes a really big difference. You can also buy that floral life extender stuff, which again, if I'm doing a wedding or a big event that's going to be several days, and I know these things have to last, or they're going to be on tables in sun or whatever, I'll use some of that floral extension stuff in the water. Again, cutting the stems under the water first, then putting them into the arrangement or whatever, and making sure that arrangement water has the floral life or whatever you want to use in there. It actually makes quite a big difference for that kind of situation, and there's a lot of stress. Even in the house, if you have the option of putting cut flowers uh, in a place where they're not going to receive direct sunlight, like instead of on a sunny windowsill, putting them somewhere where they're getting indirect light or shaded light, they'll last a lot better.
If you're cutting roses, same rules about looking for somewhere that there's going to be a bud.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things like that and sometimes you have to sacrifice if you're going to do, maybe you're doing your late peonies or something and they've got some side buds, but you need those stems. You just go ahead and take them all the way down. But if you're looking to create longevity in your plant and make sure there's more bloom coming, then yeah, with roses, you can look down and there'll be several sets of leaves with just 3 leaves under the rose, the buds, the flowers. And then when you go down further, there's sets with 5 leaves. And those are the sets you want to cut above, and you cut at a slight slant, um, which helps seal it, and go all the way down till you get to the second. Usually, I don't cut the first above the first. I go down to a couple of the five leafed stems, And then you may lose a bud or two along the way, but you're going to get better, stronger growth, regrowth. The other thing to think about is we're asking a lot of these plants if they're stressed out. So gentle watering takes, according to government studies, it takes about 15 minutes of gentle irrigation to get 6 inches deep in clay soil, right? So I think we talked about that before with lawns. Um, Same when you're kind of gardening, watering your plants, your flowers, or whatever it is. Make sure you don't need to put it there for an hour. It's going to end up on the sidewalk or down the street. But change it. Anita and I were using timers on our phones to, and I do that all the time. Like, remind yourself to move the water and keep moving it along. The troughs, we usually do 2 or 3 settings of 10 or 15 minutes because that's a big volume of soil and they can dry out. And making sure what'll happen if you water toward the edges of a trough or the edges of a big hanging basket or anything like that, the water will just pour down the sides and it won't penetrate. And I actually had several questions about people saying, well, I try to water my pea patch and the water just runs right off. It's like, well, yeah, exposed soil, again, without a mulch on top, is going to crust over, not just dry out, but it will crust over. And that crust is actually water shedding. So the way to get through that is to sprinkle, actually, and then maybe for a minute, and then leave it alone and go do something else. Come back, sprinkle again, if it's really dry, which it has been. And then you can go in, and by that we'll sort of get through that first little bit of crust, that 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch of dry soil. Then you can put on a slow bubbler or something and have it really penetrate, right?
Very helpful. Yeah.
Well, it is, because
Just
otherwise,
circle back a couple times.
right. And I make the rounds of mine. I just go through everybody and hit them 3 or 4 times, and by that time you're pretty good. Also, if you've got big containers and they're in big saucers, which they should be, I always fill the saucer so that the bottom of the soil is going to take up water too. And sometimes you'll go around and on your third pass you'll see all that water out of the saucer has been sucked up into the bottom of that container. So keep filling it. You don't want to leave standing water in containers a long time because that breeds mosquito. It's a mosquito habitat essentially, right? But making sure that those big containers are wet all the way through is really helpful because otherwise, if we're not watering deep enough, they're also drying out. And then these plants are kind of stranded because they don't have anywhere to go, right? They don't have anything waiting for them to replenish them.
In addition to water, should we be thinking about nutrients, about feeding any of these? I'm thinking tomatoes even. They're kind of a little slow this year.
Yeah, they are slow this year. It's funny. Uh, you'd think when it suddenly boomed, it was cold for a long time. We had very cool nights, and that slows them down. And they actually lose traction. They don't just stop. They actually regress a little bit to the heat lovers like beans, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants when we get the cool nights. Now the nights we're almost very consistently up in the 50s at least, low to mid 50s, which is perfect for that kind of stuff. One interesting thing is that tomatoes don't like weather that's over about 80 degrees, which always blows people's minds because you think, well, they're from these great hot places. And it's true, but they're understory plants. They're not usually full sun. I mean, they've become commercially grown that way, but in the wild, that's not how they grow. So, one of the things that can happen is that when the temperatures get really high, they'll get blossom drop and just you'll see it's called abortion. They just drop their blooms and they're like, no, I'm not going to do that. It's too much trouble. I'm hot. So when the temperatures steady out, and so one of the things that's interesting is that I've found in my little lot, I have a number of places to put tomatoes, and the ones where they get morning and midday sun but not afternoon sun are happier than the ones that get afternoon sun this year. Just because it's too much, right? They're getting blasted. So you can arrange a little bit of shade with some shade cloth or even a beach umbrella. Well, I've done that. It might look weird. You put sunglasses on your tomato plant and put a beach umbrella up, and the neighbors will think it's artwork, right? But you have to think about, what does my plant need? What does it want, right? And you're right, Reed, that fertilizing is important especially the more watering we're doing, then you want to do more fertilizing. a lot of the liquid fertilizers and the artificial, chemistry fertilizers are water soluble, so they're just going to wash right out. So every couple weeks, if you're using that kind of fertilizer, then you want to replenish it every couple weeks and after waterings, because first of all, fertilizer can burn dry roots, but also, again, until you've kind of soaked it a little bit, it might just run off and end up in the saucer. So you want to make sure the crust has been that it's taking in water well and absorbing. And after you do that, stick your finger in and see how moist it is or how deep it's moist, and then you can do your fertilizer round. Um, and the other thing is, I often use uh, this kind of scratch and scatter and scratch fertilizers like Dr. Earth, which are more long lasting because every time you water, then you're delivering a little bit more of that, which is not just going to rush all out in at one time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sometimes when I'm yapping on here, I don't know
No,
what.
I think that's good. I mean, the idea of using that Dr. Earth, some sort of, then you're not constantly trying to fight. You're working against yourself with watering.
And remember too, like the feeder roots of tomatoes are at the tips of the root. So it's like they're the explorer roots. And that's where so don't just put it around their neck because there's nothing happening around their neck. That's not where the action is at all. You want to put it more around where the drip zone is, like the drip, if it was, should it ever rain again, where the rain might fall, right? Because again, that's where all the absorption is going to take place.
And are you thinking about, you've talked in previous years as it gets this warm about trees. We normally don't think about watering trees.
Yeah, we don't normally think about watering trees, but Washington has been in a state of drought for years. We were in an emergency drought situation for a while this spring. It kind of eased off a little. We're still in a drought, but we're not in a drought emergency yet. Though I noticed that Mercer Island has water restrictions announced. Yeah, so for native trees, usually they don't like it. Especially madrones can be really susceptible, but they also are susceptible to getting molds and mildews if they have dry roots. So one of the things you might see is that kind of tarnished look to the leaves and they flag. And the other thing to remember though, this is the time when evergreens shed a lot of their foliage. They do it on a regular basis. Those leaves are designed to last 3 to 5 years, not just forever. And often it's July and August when you start to see the orange tags on the cedars, for instance, or the firs start to have brown off. If it's the whole tree, that's a problem. If it's scattered pieces here and there, and mostly on older branches, that's just part of the normal cycle. Same with madrones, same with photinia, or a lot of things like that. Rhododendrons, you'll see. People think plants are not furniture. The pieces come and go, right? But if you're seeing a lot of leaf drop, and rhododendrons will curl as a drought protect, like to try to conserve moisture. If their leaves are usually flat and it's too dry for them, they'll start to curl up, and then you can see that they're really stressed out. One of the things that happens with rhododendrons is a lot of them were initially planted in shade as young things, and then at some point the tree that was shading them gets cut down, or somebody moves in and cuts down a bunch of trees, and suddenly they're in full sun. With rhododendrons, the smaller the leaf, the more sun they can handle. The larger the leaf, the less direct sun they handle. If they're on the east side of the house, they're probably fine. North side, they're fine. But south and west can be challenging for a lot. Well, hydrangeas too. You can see hydrangeas that look great for a long time and then they suddenly just collapse and flag. They don't like afternoon sun. It's too harsh, especially unfiltered. Um, so that's another thing you could consider, moving some of those plants that are struggling, not now, because that's just going to kill them, but in the rainy season, in the cooler months. October, November, December are great times to move, transplant shrubs and trees and perennials and pretty much anything, really.
This is a good time to think about
Yeah.
what you might want to do.
And the cool thing to do, this took me years to learn, is write in your calendar ahead of time and put in, say, early in November, move that hydrangea or whatever. And then you'll be like, why did I write that? Oh, yeah. You can even take a picture to remind
Yeah.
yourself.
Don't just write hydrangea. That's what I
Right.
would do.
Like, which one did I think I wanted? No, you got to be specific, but it's a really good way to kind of trigger the, what you were trying to remember to do, right?
So another note, you were going to talk about scalding. I guess that
Yes,
might go with what we're talking about here.
it kind of does. One of the things that can happen with soft fruit, strawberries, will sometimes get what looks like a yellow patch on the side of the skin. Raspberries, I tried to find one that had it. It's kind of hard to see, but can you see that there's slightly gray pieces there? So
Yeah.
that's too much sun. That's like if it's mold, it's fuzzy, it's mold. You can tell it's gross and squishy. But when it just has that, and tomatoes can look like that too. They can get the yellowing, like the skin will turn yellow and almost look transparent sometimes. Or there's a window zone there. You think, what is that? This must be a terrible disease? It's not. It's excess sun, and they're perfectly okay to eat. They're fine to use, but it's more typical in like long hot summers like this one. And also, if you've got indeterminate tomatoes that are those ones that just want to keep going till the end of their life, and you start pruning them back, or you prune a lot of the foliage off so that the fruit can get more sun and ripen better. Sometimes if you take too much shading foliage too quickly, the fruit that's been in shade is suddenly exposed to full sun. And again, it might be afternoon sun, and they're getting burned. That's another place where you could consider a little bit of screen or shade cloth, or even, like I said, that silly old beach umbrella, just for a while to get them acclimated, and then they'll be fine. But it's nothing you have to really worry about. The other thing to remember with tomatoes is like early blight and late blight can be problematic in dry years like this. And one of the best ways to avoid that is to mulch your plants with coffee grounds, used coffee grounds. It's very effective with those blights. And also slugs don't like it. Slugs don't really like tomatoes all that much either. But if you have plants that the slugs are all over, though in this kind of heat and drought, the slugs are not the problem that they can be at other times. Um, but snails are more apt to do that because they have a little more protection, and so they are more hardy in this kind of dry, hot situation. But anyway, those coffee grounds are great for tomatoes, um, and they're also just good for roses. You were talking about getting roses to rebloom. They like their snacks, right? And another thing that's really helpful for them is corn gluten, which is like high 911 or 912. And that's another great mulch, which is also going to suppress weed germination, seed in any kind of seed germination. So when you're prepping your bed for fall and you're getting ready to sow your seeds, don't put the corn gluten on until the seeds have sprouted, or they won't sprout at all.
So yeah, so thinking about the fall, is this I mean, I know it's a ways off, but
It's tomorrow, Reed. Fall is upon us. I mean, it's crazy, but we're almost through July. And then it one of the things that always seems weird is like in the hottest, driest part of the year, you're thinking about cool crops. And of course, they're not that happy to be dumped suddenly in the middle of a hot, dry, open patch without any mulch or anything else. So again, those are plants that if you're going to start bringing in the fall starts, think about which ones can take the sun the best, and think about if you have corn or squash or things like that that are providing some shade, you can plant your fall crops where they're going to get shaded part of the day, and they won't mind that. That's actually fine for them. So it's part of your succession planting, right? If you've got peas and beans and things like that, um, consider them to be screen for your fall starts. And the things, I mean, I always put kale in. Kale is not always annual. Kale can be perennial and can last quite a long time. Some of the kales really struggled in the winter because we had again that freeze that we had 4 or 5 days of and nights of below freezing, and that is extremely unusual. And usually it'll freeze at night and then be above freezing in the daytime, and the plants get a little chance to reboot. And but when it was that cold, a lot of things got hit very, very hard. And
yes, our cosmic kale went into the cosmos.
yeah, yeah, it's hard for them. Um, so, but usually cosmic kale, which is that beautiful variegated one, that's a hybrid, a Dutch hybrid between um, two kinds of kale and a cabbage. And it's so mild and sweet and beautiful, and it's variegated. It's really pretty. It's got big, beautiful, succulent leaves. It's one of my favorites, but it isn't the hardiest in the world. And again, mulching is helpful. Um, one thing we were seeing this year was like when we did too big of a cleanup in the fall, some things that were perennial or woody or shrubby that would have been protected by what was around them got hammered because it didn't have any company. So I'm going to be a little less rigorous about taking out company plants that I might typically cut hard or take out altogether. I might wait and let them be a little bit of protection for some of the more tender things, like one of our olive trees, for instance. Uh, that would have done better if it had been surrounded by, I think, calendulas and nigella that love in the mist, which is another great cut flower, by the way. But we
Love in the mist.
love in the mist. They're beautiful, little blue, sort of, I can't, lacy looking flowers. And the seed heads look like inflated striped purple balloons with little horns on the top. They're beautiful and very loved by flower arrangers, right? Um, but it's one of those ones that will self sow like calendulas pretty abundantly, easy to pull, so it's not like a terrorist or anything. Um, but it also, we had quite a thicket of that around a couple of the tender plants when we pulled it out, and we probably should have just left it there to take some of the brunt of the frost. It's weird to be thinking about those things now, but you got to always be thinking and planning ahead in the garden because there's always stuff to do later that I get, like the hydrangeas, or the plants that are flagging in the where they are. If you're thinking about moving something, write yourself a note. Uh, that will make it a lot easier to follow through. And
And
even,
is
yeah,
is Love in the Mist, is that the one that has kind of that licorice smell? There's a blue flower that has a licorice.
I'm not aware of it having a licorice smell really, but I think agastache does definitely. Yeah,
Oh,
that's what the love in the mist looks like. It looks a bit like a cornflower.
okay. That we have, I think, in the right where we were deadheading today. There
Yes,
was,
and see the twirly bits? I mean, they're so cute. They look like little ballet dancers.
oh, there they are. Yes. Yeah.
And they're edible. The seeds are used in cooking in Turkey and Iraq, places like that. Yeah, look at those pods. Aren't they awesome? And they're like I said, when they dry, they're just beautiful, but they look like little balloons with horns, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's another great easygoing plant that makes a good cut flower and will self-sow a bit, not enough to be annoying. And like I said, easy, easy. If you want to get rid of them, you just pull them up and they're not persistent. It's not like a blackberry. Um, just easy to take care of, right? And you were talking about cut flowers before that.
Yeah, I have another question about it, going back to the cut flower. I there's where I live, there's a cut flower garden, I think they call it. And so it has lots of daisies and lots of coneflowers. And I thought, oh, they're so abundant. But I know I've been probably when I walk the dog at noon, I'll nip off a few, which is not the right time to do it, as you said. But I just thought, oh, they're so hardy. But no, I bring the daisies in and they maybe last half a day. And I thought when I was younger, I was picking daisy bouquets, and making things out of daisies. And so I'm just shocked and thinking, well, is this just not a very good cut flower, or should I be doing something other than cutting them at noon, of course?
I think part of it is that cutting them in the heat of the day, and then possibly if you're still walking the dog, walking around with them in your hand for a while, that's not really helping either.
Yeah.
And then maybe going out for coffee and stopping back. It's like, now they're hostage, right?
Yeah.
So again, if you want a cut flower to last, plan to go cut them and then do something with them right
Uh,
away.
yeah. Yeah.
Marcy, uh,
So that idea of actually soaking them right away,
yeah.
like you were talking about, if you're going to be it doesn't hurt even if you're just going to put them inside.
No, exactly. And the thing is, people are like, well, why would you cover it with water? And it's like, well, if it was raining, they'd get wet all over. They don't have little rain jackets. So I actually immerse them, especially if it's been hot and dry. And perhaps that cutting garden doesn't get watered much.
I don't think it does.
Yeah, so they're already a little drought stressed, right?
Yeah.
And they might do better if you cut them early in the morning, plunge them, and then, recut the stems under the water, like all that stuff I was saying, and then keep them out of the sun. They'd probably do a lot better.
Okay, I'll
Marcy,
experiment. Thank you.
yeah. Marcy, did you have a question? You're muted.
There it is. The pots of potted plants and moisture meter. I have two moisture meters. They don't always agree with each other. And I'm trying just to be sure that the water is actually getting down into the roots and not just getting that for top, a couple inches. Do you have any advice or information about moisture meters?
Well, my moisture meter is on the end of my hand. And I really do just like stick it in. But again, like I was saying earlier, if you have a big container, try if you can find a big saucer for it.
Uh-huh.
You know, Rite Aid traditionally has saucers for a few weeks in April, and then they put them on half price almost immediately and they disappear. But if you get in there soon enough, they're inexpensive and long lasting, very sturdy and tough. Or, some of the nurseries will have them, but I'm talking a big saucer because then you can fill the saucer and make sure that you're watering the bottom as well. But yeah, otherwise, that thing I was talking about before too is like making several passes. And sometimes I'll have a bucket next to things that are vulnerable like that, fill the bucket, and then every time I pass, I'll tip some of the bucket into it, which delivers more than me standing there and saying, oh, my phone just rang, or oh, I forgot to do this and run off and do something else. It's hard to keep, there's supposed to be a meditative practice of watering, but it always escapes me personally. I'm better putting something there like a little bubbler in a big container. You can put a bubbler in a big container. Those ones, they're small, they're about this big, and they attach to the end of your hose and they just burble. And you don't have to set them very high, but they'll deliver water steadily without spraying all over the place. One of the things Anita and I have just been trying to water with a sprayer essentially, and you have to set it just right or it just like shoots all over and it's not really doing what you thought it was going to do. Does that help? I hope.
Well, yeah, more or less.
I think the moisture meters are difficult because they're usually, unless they're extremely expensive scientific tools,
Yeah.
they're cheap and not really very good.
Yeah, good. That's my impression. I just double check. Okay.
No, you're quite right. And if you're in doubt that it's wet enough, it's probably not.
Yeah.
So in this kind of weather, I water every day.
Oh yeah, I water every morning or every evening, depending on what the weather's been. But and they're doing very well. I just began to, but the thing about putting them onto something that collects the water under them is something I'll have to try to figure out.
Yeah.
If it's possible, because they're large and they're heavy.
Right. And, one of the major principles of sustainable gardening is causing difficult things to be done by other people. Right. So I know you've got great neighbors. Maybe some of those kids would come over. And with those pots, you can rock them. You don't have to like pick it up. Rock it, have something under there, rock it back, shovel it around, and then you can nest them in it.
Oh yeah, I'm not going to be picking up anything like that. But
So you mentioned kale. Other things that we might want to be thinking about starts?
Yeah, so garlic you can plant several times of the year. The traditional for the summer garlic is to plant it at midwinter, like at the winter solstice. But for the garlic that we're going to be enjoying at Thanksgiving or whatever during those holiday times, you can plant now. So when you buy, say, organic garlic and it starts to sprout, you can just start tucking them into the garden between things, and they'll fatten up and make nice big cloves for you. By the time, in 3 or 4 months, they'll be ready to harvest. And leeks are another one that you can buy little starts. Leeks from seed takes a couple of years actually to really get them good, which is sort of pointless. So, buying a handful of leek starts is a great way to go. And you plant them kind of deep because they really are typically a bulb. And the way that because you're mostly going to use that white part, right? So you plant them in a trench and fill the trench in and then hill it up kind of, and you can even pile mulch around that, and that will give you more of the white stem, which is what the sweet part that you actually want to use, right? So leeks are another thing. Brussels sprouts are something to be started anytime in the next month or so. Um, the cabbages are cool season. The thing about small starts for some of those uh, broccoli cabbage is they can bolt early because it's just too hot for them. So again, a shady position and waiting a little bit longer for those because they're very sensitive. Um, I had some red romaine and I let it bolt because I wanted it to bloom. Well, it's like 7 feet tall. It's this huge burgundy red tower, which is amazing, but it hasn't bloomed yet, but it's pretty impressive. And interestingly, you can still, picking the leaves off the sides and they're delicious. So I thought this is interesting. I never had an elevator, uh,
Elevator
elevator lettuce
lettuce.
before, right? It's a
Yeah.
red romaine. Wow, it's tough. But if you, like me, I have a small household and not a lot of salad eaters. It's sort of pointless to grow 15 heads of something if you're not really going to use them. So getting a seed mix, like Ed Hume has a nice mesclun mix, and just putting in a few, a 6-inch patch of it every few weeks, you can harvest off that and you can do that all through the summer. Again, in the shade of your peas and beans or behind some of those taller plants that will, so they don't get blasted because they don't really like that. I
And
was
so,
trying
and so like, and so obviously if it's warmer, you're more likely to get that bolting that you just described.
yeah.
Um, and if I just keep, as it cools off, they'll continue to grow. I'll keep sowing them and they'll last a little longer.
Yeah, and the other thing you can do is when you see they're starting to bolt, is cut the stem back pretty hard. Like some of the curly kales will do side shoots with, and you can cut the whole side shoots off, and they'll be great. And then it'll keep producing from the base, which and also like broccoli. When you get to the broccoli stage, sometimes they start doing little offshoots like broccolini, and you can just keep cutting those off. I've had them go last through March some years, like all the way through the winter, not on the bad winters we've had recently, but in the milder winters that we used to have, you could harvest kale and broccoli for months, right? And I still find if you like with both cauliflower and and broccoli, or any of the that family, you can cut the main head and leave, because usually it comes off at least this much stem and there's some side leaves. Leave those, and they'll keep sending up those little side shoots, and you'll get little, but that's okay. I mean, you get a nice little handful of sprouts, right? Also, the flowers. If you let some of the kale and lettuce go to flower, the flowers are edible and they're really delicious, and you can put them in stir fries and salads and things like that. So I let some bloom because they're great pollinator plants, and that way, a lot of times you'll get self-sown descendants. Like kales are famous for sowing themselves all over the place. It's great.
Can I ask you more about garlic?
Yeah.
So I was all excited. I loved when I lived in Ohio. I loved growing garlic, and I would grow a patch and watch it go. Actually, let it bloom many times because I thought that was so pretty. Enjoy the scapes. Well, so I planted garlic here. I bought just organic garlic at the grocery and planted the biggest bulbs, and it seemed to do well. But I only got one scape, and right now it's getting it's the leaves are drying. It's turning brown, and I I'm comparing it to Ohio garlic and realizing it's not doing the same, Anita. So so should I harvest the garlic now? I
Yeah.
was hoping to get a braid of garlic, Um, I I don't know. Well, I haven't had the courage to dig up a bulb yet, so I'll do that soon.
Once they start to brown, yeah, it's like with onions. You just knock down the foliage and let it brown off. Um,
Okay.
and sometimes I'll put little toothpicks to remind myself where they are if the foliage gets pulled off or something. And then
Mhm.
pick them up, and maybe the heads will only be this big instead of big and fat. Part of that is because the soil is probably not in the best condition and not as nutritive as it could be. So you maybe put down some bone meal, again, some Dr. Earth next
Oh,
time, for the next batch that you do, so that they're getting a steady feeding. Because,
And I can plant garlic in that same area again
well,
then?
I try never to, it's like you don't want to follow a root crop with a root crop. So that might be where I put my next batch of lettuce, and where
Okay.
the greens used to be, that's where you can move. But you can put garlic between things, like between your tomatoes and your peppers or whatever, and just poke them in here and there. They don't have to be in a row um, at all. So I tuck them in, and you can cut when they get multiple scapes. If you cut the main scape so it doesn't bloom, usually they'll send up more, and then you can use them like chives too.
Mhm.
And just cut them into your salad or whatever. But if you take too much, it's not going to head up as nicely as it would.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll keep experimenting.
Yeah. Did we?
I think we covered what we were planning on talking about. Are
Yeah.
there any final thoughts for this get together?
Oh, I did have one. I was going to talk a little bit about lavender because somebody asked me how to save their lavender. And the thing that always happens is people wait until the lavender starts to kind of fall off. But if you want to save it for the full fragrance and dry it that way, or you want to use the stems for crafting, you have to cut them in their prime, which is pretty well now, and cut the longest stems you can and bundle them loosely and hang them upside down in a dim, cool place like the garage, maybe, or the laundry room or something. Well, if your laundry room is humid, maybe not, but mine happens to be pretty dry. But a dry place so that they're not going to get moldy or anything, but they need to be out of direct sun so they can dry properly. Um, but that picking harvesting before they dry off will give you a much better flavor and a more long, I mean, it's well, flavor too, actually, in culinary use, but more fragrance and longer lasting fragrance. And again, you want to pick them in the morning early when they're at the peak of their volatile oil production. And that's another kind of thing. Like you don't harvest really very many things in the middle heat of the day, except in commercial agriculture, which is inhumane and horrible. So we don't want to do that.
Hey, on that note, we will, on that note of inhumane and horribleness, we will take a break. Thank you very much, Ann.
Thank you, everybody. See ya.